Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
Welcome to Between the Lines. My name is Lou Palumbo. We are inundated with controversy in this country and even globally. We have an interesting guest today who's been here, I think, for the third time. He's a PhD in philosophy. He's written 17 books. Taras Kuzio. We're going to speak with him shortly. We're also going to speak about this incident at the Academy Awards. Reason being, it has an interesting implication and translates to the country as a whole. So I see I have my friend Taras with me. Without further ado, if I may introduce Mr. Kuzio. Are you there, sir?
Yes, I am, yes.
How are you, Taras?
Hi. We finally got the timing right.
That's okay. No big deal. We'll get it working. So I want to just say one thing right out of the gate. You were right. Putin does not have the ability to sustain this interaction, this invasion in the Ukraine. And I'm struggling to understand at this point what the endgame is when you destroy a city like Mariupol. If you look at the photos as the condition of this city, what good will he gain in now occupying and controlling a city that has basically been pretty much evacuated, for one, and this seems to be pervasive in any area of addressment that he undertakes. So what's he thinking about, Taras?
Well, this is a rather unpleasant question because I have to try to get into the head of a sociopath. Unlike your President Bush, I don't think he has a soul. He's used the same tools of mass slaughter of civilians, destruction of property that he's been doing throughout his presidency. We have chosen to ignore this in the West. We have not said, hey, you can't get away with this kind of stuff. I mean, this has been going on even before he became president. There were a lot of people, for example, who poo-pooed the idea that it could have been the Russian intelligence services that blew up those apartment buildings in Moscow in September 1999 as a way of generating this sort of nationalistic mobilization upon which he would come into power. And now we can see that pretty much he probably did. His people probably did blow up those apartment buildings. It wasn't the Chechens who were blamed for it at the time. So, okay, we've got 1999, 300 Russians, civilians are killed by the Russian intelligence service as a way to mobilize that nationalism for Putin to come to power. A year later, that ignites a war in Chechnya, again, in the autonomous region of Chechnya inside Russia. What does he do? He flattens the capital city of Grozny, kills about 10% of the population. So that's already 23 years ago. Then he does the same thing in Syria when he intervenes in 2015, because he sees a vacuum. Barack Obama's red lines were never red and were never red lines. He goes in and he helps Saddam Hussein to commit massive atrocities. And he does it for a second reason, to generate a wave of refugees and migrants flowing into Europe, which of course then increases support for the far right, the anti-immigration far right in Europe. It's a deliberate tactic to what he does. And the same Syrian methods, shall we say, have been now applied to Ukraine.
I want to stop you for 1 second, if I may, Taras, because, we're hearing consistent references to peace talks. that are occurring in
Right.
Turkey. My perception is this is all a ruse, that there's no real sincere investment in attempting to resolve this through a peaceful negotiation, which is difficult for me to wrap my arms around, that you have to negotiate with an invader of your country. You have to make concessions with him. He should leave unconditionally, period, end of discussion. But my perception, I'd like to hear your point of view on this, is that this is all a ruse. This is all smoke and mirrors. I don't think that the Russians are sincerely invested in trying to resolve this in an amicable fashion, period, end of my statement. So I want to hear what your position is on this.
You're right to be very suspicious because the people in charge of Russia, in Western academics call Russia a militocracy. It's a regime run by the intelligence services of the former Soviet Union. The KGB run contemporary Russia. There's no denial about that. The mentality of that kind of person is compromise, the dirty word. It's an Anglo-Saxon dirty word. We don't do compromise, we do surrender. So you're right to be suspicious that what's Putin up to? Is he trying to sort of get some breathing space to then relaunch his attacks? He certainly, the idea that Putin would admit defeat, would admit withdrawal, would be simply impossible, I think, because if he is seen to be somebody who's been defeated, it's the end of his time in office. I mean,
I think that's here anyway, though, to be very candid with you. I think you pointed out the fact that he bit off more than he could chew. And I think the end game on this for him is ultimately going to be his demise. And I'm not necessarily...
I think you're right in the sense that you're right that prior to the invasion, I was pretty much convinced he was president for life. That's how he changed the constitution 3 years ago to ensure that was going to happen. And in that kind of system where everybody's a crook and there's no honor amongst thieves, as it were, you can't leave office. If you leave office, you're done, right? But now with this invasion, then his position does look shakier. And for all sorts of reasons, the number of casualties coming back, the state of the economy and finances from sanctions.
Don't forget the oligarchs.
The oligarchs. And also the huge number of senior officers killed. I mean, 7 generals killed in a month, plus about another 13, 14 other middle and senior ranking officers from the elite parts of the army have been killed. So that also sends shockwaves amongst the sort of the commanding officers. They don't give a damn about the conscripts, the 18-year-olds. Those are just, cannon fodder for the meat grinder. But senior officers is a different ballgame.
I want to ask you a really important question, Taras, not to interrupt you. I apologize, sir. We're hearing as many as 4 million people have left their home, their country. Do you think there's ever going to be an opportunity for them to return? And the other part of this discussion is the rebuild. Obviously, I don't believe Ukraine will have the ability to rebuild these cities on their own. I think that should be a global exercise. That's just my opinion. But what do you think the future is for the Ukrainians that have had to flee to all these countries, Poland, etc.? And there's another question I'm going to have just to follow up with you as to what your final prediction is going to be. So start thinking about that. That's the end of this thing. And I also want to address this thing of about 2,300 kids that have gone into Russia. But what's the future for the people who have left?
I think that most of them, and I have friends who are in as refugees in France, Berlin, and such like. I think most of them want to go back because they've left in a hurry apartments, cars, possessions, and such like. They haven't emigrated, consciously. They've just left in a hurry. So I think most of them want to go back. I mean, probably not 100% of them. But we're talking a far larger number than you mentioned. It's 4 million refugees who have gone abroad and 6 million what are called IDPs, internally displaced people. So that's a total of 10 million. That's a quarter of the population.
Correct.
That's the equivalent of something like 70 million people in the U.S. if it was a U.S.
Proportionally, correct.
Proportionally, yeah. That's a huge number of people, and a huge number of those are kids. They're traumatized kids. United Nations has already talked about that's going to be a major factor. On the question of reparations, or post-war reconstruction, well, there's going to be two sources, I think, of funding. One of them would be some kind of system of reparations paid for by Russia. Whether Russia would agree, another matter. But
are they in a position to? Are they in a position to? The question here is that after Putin decimates these cities, he doesn't have the money to rebuild them. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, it would have to be something like Russia would have to forego a percentage of the profits it makes from the export of oil and gas, say, I don't know, 25, 30%, and would have to go into a separate fund used for Ukraine. And then the second one would be potentially nationalization of oligarch assets in the West. Another one, that money could be used, Russian oligarchs. And thirdly, of course, some kind of new Marshall Plan organized by international organizations where the West has influence, like European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IMF, and elsewhere. So it would be a massive task, but the cities that would be rebuilt as European cities. They would no longer have any Soviet architecture.
Interesting.
That would be the irony.
I think that the West is going to have to heavily contribute to the rebuild of this country eventually. And another question's coming up. I said this a very long time ago, that one of the concessions that might have to be made in order for Putin to save face and allow him to kind of extricate himself from this disaster is that they would have to agree to never allow the Ukraine to be part of NATO, which I don't agree with, by the way. I don't think any foreign entity should how would you say, influence your destiny. I look at the United States, and this is something more we're taking on right now. I don't know how much we're going to contribute, how much we should contribute. Obviously, the people that have skin in the game, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is European nations, the EU, for example, right? They should step up. I think it should be a global effort or global response. That's my opinion. Taras, please allow me to go to a break, sir. We're going to come right back to you. Guys, this is Between the Lines, and my name is Lou, and we have a brilliant man with us today, Taras Kuzio, who is an expert on Russia and the Ukraine. He's written 17 books. He's a PhD in philosophy. He's got an amazing insight. We'll be right back. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. We have with us Taras Kuzio, who has been kind enough to join us again for the third time to enlighten us as to what's transpiring in the Ukraine. His observations are very critical because they're usually accurate. He predicted, for example, that this would not go well for Putin, that Putin was overstepping himself. Taras, I want to get into this discussion with you about the sources that are saying that as many as 2,300 children have been abducted from the Ukraine and brought into Russia. Do you know anything about this, sir, as far as the legitimacy of that claim?
Well, there's no question it's true. They've been taken primarily from the bombed out city of Mariupol, where this was a city of 450,000 people before the war. There's still 170,000 people trapped there with no food and water. So that's already a war crime that Vladimir Putin is not allowing those people to leave. Russian forces have kidnapped those children and taken them to Russia, and they will be used as some kind of hostages, some kind of way to do some kind of deal, or just be kept there as and given over to Russian parents without children, maybe.
Taras,
really is bizarre.
Yeah,
really
let me say one thing to you, so everyone, you understand my position. This was the line in the sand. When you start abducting children, I'm prepared to go to war with you, and let the chips fall where they may. I don't think Mr. Putin has this, how would you say, indiscriminate ability to just start to deploy nuclear weapons. I think there's a food chain here, part of which is China. And I don't expect you to speak as to the policies or mentality or approach that China might have. But I don't think he just has this ability to suddenly start launching nuclear devices. No. And I think we've got to stop, how would you say, sitting on our hands because we're fearful he might do that. My position with this guy is if that's the direction you want to take this, then let it be. The real tragic part of this is that the Russian people who are not part of this endeavor are suffering the most from this, along with the Ukrainians, of course, because the sanctions are impacting them. And they're not impacting Putin, by the way, or they are impacting the oligarchs. I mean, the oligarchs are suffering from, how would you say, the freezing of accounts, the seizure of properties, boats, condominiums.
Don't worry, they've got enough hidden away.
That's my point, sir. So you could take their yacht; they're still doing fine. At some point, there's got to be an unabated accountability for Putin. As far as China goes, I hope China's watching closely to see how the world is turned against Putin. And they will turn against them if they go into Taiwan. And Taiwan, again, is another discussion that I don't want to hamstring you with. But I am concerned about this episode of abducting children. I think that's the line in the sand. I don't know when we're going to grow a pair of balls. Excuse me, am I allowed to say that? In plain English.
Well, you said it.
I know. Well, they can edit me. This guy's he's in charge of that part of this thing. Gary is. But this is.
You can use the word kahunas in future.
Cojones. I agree. Okay, we'll do that. But you understand my point. This is the line in the sand. You start snatching children, I go after you. I don't care. Go into Russia, go after them, bomb them in their own. I mean, the key here is not to, in kind, start to indiscriminately kill Russian people, because I guarantee you they didn't sign on for this. The same way our public is just trying to skip through the day, Taras, and pay bills and take care of their children and plan vacations. That's what the Russian people are doing. They're just trying to survive. They're not the policymakers, just like we're not. This is really tragic. And unfortunately, I hope the American public isn't garnering animosity and resentment towards Russia. This seems to be one man with an agenda who, I guess for whatever reason, was able to garner so much power and position that it almost appears as if he's untouchable. Is that an accurate observation? The untouchable part. He's frozen.
Did we lose him?
Did we lose you, Taras?
No, I lost you for a second, but I know your train of thought. Russia moved from a collective type of leadership to a dictatorship 3 years ago when the constitution was changed. So this is entirely Putin's war. He's not listening to any advisors. There's no kind of council of elders around him, or as it were. And he's had an obsession with Ukraine for a long time for sort of nationalistic and other reasons. He thinks he should be going into Russian history as the guy who took down Ukraine, brought it back, and got rid of Western influence there. That's his crazy. Where it becomes very difficult, I think, for Americans and even Europeans to get into his head is that this is a 21st century war driven by 19th century nationalistic myths. And so there's a disconnect, between normal people like us living in the 21st century and this guy who's stuck in an era when the British Empire still existed.
Yeah.
So of course, his biggest paradox, he said, there is no Ukrainian nation. Well, that Ukrainian nation just kicked his ass and his troops. And I think this is the image of Russia has suffered terribly here, including vis-a-vis China, by the way, because this is supposed to be a great power. And it's been humiliated by a country a third of its size. And one of the reasons for that, it isn't just, and morale is very important for soldiers in the war, of course, and the Russian morale is very low, But a big and major point is that the Russian army can't be separated from the rest of Russia. So if the rest of Russia's, just a kleptocratic, corrupt state, it's a mafia state, then that's going to affect the Russian army. And there are so many countless examples of how that corruption has just meant this Russian military machine doesn't operate properly. I'll give you just two quick examples. These are items that Ukrainian forces have found on military equipment that's been captured. So one, Russian troops are given 7-year out-of-date food rations. Secondly, Russian troops have medical kits from 1978. I have photographs of both. I mean, could you imagine sending American troops into battle with 44-year-old medical kits? I mean, those troops would say, what the hell is this? And thirdly, they don't give a damn about collecting their dead from the battlefield. They just don't care. I mean, this isn't a matter of honor for Ukrainian Western countries that, if somebody dies for the country, they should be given all the honors that the state should give them. No, not for this. So
that's interesting insight for people to hear about, to be very candid with you, because we've not heard this spoken to before. I want to ask you this about the Russian troops. How many would you conservatively estimate have died during this conflict? Because, we really can't figure out. I'm not out there counting bodies. I'm wondering if you have any insight.
Well, we can to some degree. I mean, and I think the U.S. conservative estimate is something around 7,000 dead. The Ukrainian one is somewhere double that, so 14,000. Let's take the figure in between, 10. Now, if you add to that 10,000 dead, usually the ratio of wounded to dead is 3-to-1. So that's 30,000. So 10,000 dead, 30,000 wounded. That's 40,000 out of action, plus prisoners of war, plus deserters. That's nearly a third of their invading army in 1 month. 10,000 dead troops is already more than the US lost in Iraq and Afghanistan, combined, by the way, over 10, 20 years. It's also 10,000 dead is also 2/3 of what the USSR lost in Afghanistan over the whole 1980s. The USSR lost 15,000 soldiers there. So that's a huge number for 1 month. I don't see, it's difficult to see how that continues to be sustainable. I mean, how can you keep having those losses? If that was a Western government, if that was the US or Britain or European government, the government would be overthrown. There would be a crisis. There would be a vote of no confidence and saying, this is a disaster. But in Russia, nobody cares because they're just conscripts. They're just,
Taras, I wonder, sir, is it a cumulative product of them not caring, but also realizing there's not much they can do? I don't want to go off onto a tangent discussion about gun control, for example, but we know that we're watching governments disarm their populace, which gives them, I would say, unimpeded control of the populace. I mean, what are the Russians going to do unless we decided to start flooding the citizenry there with assault rifles the way we did in the Ukraine? I mean, you've heard the same things, and you probably have more knowledge on this topic than I do, but they're saying in the tens of thousands every day, distributing AK-47s or M4s coming from us to the citizens there to fight back. What are the poor Russian people going to do? I mean, the only people carrying guns there are the cops and the military.
Right. I mean, if you're a soldier in the field from Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine has a very good system in place that you can desert with your tank or whatever it is, and you get a money bonus and the ability to stay in Ukraine as a citizen. There have been already cases of soldiers turning up with tanks, getting their $7,000 or whatever, and saying, I've had enough of this shit. You can also run back to Russia. There's been loads of cases of desertions. There have been funny cases of soldiers walking into a police station and saying, we can buy some petrol? Well, obviously they're not trying to buy petrol. They're trying to get arrested, so they don't want to fight. So there are ways you can do it, but sure. I mean, there was a case last week, 5 days ago, where 2 Russian soldiers drove a tank over a general because the general was so useless that they'd lost half of their brigade. So that's about 1,000 soldiers.
They call that fragging, by the way. We did that in Vietnam, fragging. Supposedly. But go ahead, continue.
Yeah. I mean, so there's different things happening, but sure, I think we are looking at 2 different approaches to human life. I mean, we value human life in a democracy. Life is important, and soldiers in particular are given a lot of value because they've lost their lives in the cause of serving their country. In Russia, that's just not there. That emphasis on the value of human life.
Do they do anything for the families of these soldiers that have fallen in Russia, Taras?
Well, I mean, I guess in some cases they are informed. In other cases, they're missing in action.
No, I mean, do they do anything for them? Is there any form of
I think they give them some monetary payment, but I don't think it's it's not a huge amount of money, and that's assuming they get the information. Because if the bodies have been left in the fields, then they will never hear about where their son is, dead. Because it's Ukrainian volunteers and Ukrainian soldiers that are collecting bodies from fields and sending them back to Russia. So the Russians don't give a damn about them.
Interesting.
I mean,
so Ross, we've got to go to a quick break, sir, if I may. Thank our sponsors, Instacart, Spotify. We're going to be right back, guys. Taras, just bear with me, sir, because I have that big final question regarding a prediction. We'll be right back, guys. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. Okay, we're back, ladies and gentlemen, and with us we have Taras Kuzio. He has written 17 books. He's a PhD in political science, not philosophy. That was my major, and I'm not a PhD. He has an interesting insight and understanding of what's actually going on in the Ukraine, and he's already allowed us to hear some rather interesting information. And I want to just give you the last question of the day, your prediction, Taras, if you have one.
Ukrainian forces have successfully fought the Russian forces to a stalemate, which means that Plan A, for Putin's Plan A, which was to capture the country, occupy the country, get the president to flee, capture the capital city, is gone. That's not going to happen. So Plan B, I think is the new Putin plan. I don't think it's going to happen straight away. I think there's going to be, you're right, the peace negotiations are a bit of a sham. There's going to be a jockeying for power with more military engagements. Ukrainians are conducting counteroffensives in the north and northeast. The key, I think, stumbling block area is what the Russians have occupied in the southeast, which using troops which were already based in Crimea, places like Mariupol. Because what the Russians want is this kind of land bridge going from Russia through Mariupol down to Crimea. And the secondary reason for that is to block Ukraine's access to the Black Sea.
Taras, I want to ask you this question. Would you happen to know who actually has control of the nukes in Russia? Is it Putin, or who's controlling this?
Well, Putin and senior military leaders. I agree with you. I don't think that this is a false flag idea that somehow Russia or Putin's going to revert to nuclear weapons. I mean, what this conflict has shown is the lack of backbone of a lot of Western leaders, including Biden, on this question. The biggest unfortunate aspect of this war of these missiles being fired into Russia, fired from Russia and Belarus into Ukraine, and he's fired about 1,200 of them. 1,200. That's more than they fired in Syria. And those are the ones destroying buildings and killing civilians and creating refugees. The West has not done anything to stop that. That's where there should have been some attempt to stop it. Of course, the West has to now start helping in the refinancing of the rebuilding of those cities, but it did nothing to stop those missiles coming in. And it could have done. I think it could have done. There's also been no attempt to create some kind of humanitarian safe zone, say in the west of the country, which could have been done with a limited, shall we say, no-fly zone. It didn't have to be NATO. It could have been the UN or European Union. So I think there's been both a lack of backbone and a lack of brainstorming as to what options can we have here to do.
Taras, I mean, we're going to close, my friend, but I just want to say one thing, and this is the part of this discussion that confuses me, not ours. When Putin postured 70,000 troops on the border of Ukraine, we should have installed missile defense systems and started to pour in assets and resources from everywhere in the West in anticipation. Instead, we let him catch us with our pants around our ankles. Let's be honest. Yeah. That's exactly what happened here, which makes me further question, who's calling the shots in Washington. And I'm just not pointing the finger at Joe Biden. I mean, there's problems here with Joe Biden. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I don't say that politically. Father Time has caught him. But we sat on our heels here. And the mistake we made was not preparing for this man to carry through. We have to go today. Taras, I want to invite you back, sir, again, because these discussions are always quite revealing. And I can't thank you enough. Guys, we're going to take a quick break. This is Between the Lines, and I thank you once again, Mr. Kuzio.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to having you back, sir. Thank you, guys. We'll be right back. Guys, we're back, and we're going to go to some questions. Jenni, Jenni, from Springfield, Illinois, is asking, Antarctica currently has a heat wave 70 degrees, above normal. This is unheard of in the history of climatology. I feel like the climate change and rising tides is one of those things no one cares about until it's going to be too late. If World War III happens, this might be our demise. What can we do to raise awareness and be proactive in solving this imminent problem? I love the fact that we intellectualize all these problems, and more importantly, we politicize them. As far as the climate goes, I would like to always hear from the scientists, not the politicians, number one. I gather you have a two-part question here, Jenni, also because you allude to World War III, which could be an interesting occurrence. But in reference to the climate, let me stay on topic with you. I think we need to continue to examine or explore what is causing the climate change, because it is occurring. Whether Republicans like it, the Democrats like it, it shouldn't be really a political discussion. It should be a discussion that takes place through science. We do know that the water temperatures are elevating. I hear as much as 3-4 degrees. The seas are rising as much as a foot. They predict that cities like Miami, for example, will be underwater maybe in 10, 20 years. This is something real. It would be lovely if once again we could put our differences down and I would say take the politics out of the discussion and start to have some productive discussions as to what we're going to do to offset this. Maybe this is just a cycle of nature. Maybe it's man contributing to a change in the atmosphere, which impacts climate and ultimately the melting up in the Antarctic. Maybe it's both. Either way, why don't we start to figure out what it is we're going to do to protect our people here and internationally? Do we need retaining walls? Is there a way to dredge? I mean, I'm not in the Army Corps of Engineers, but I have seen them in action. I worked at a beach as a lifeguard. I watched the ocean converge on the sand, and they'd go offshore, dredge, and then drop the sand back on to rebuild the beach. There's something we have to do, I would say, jointly to address this problem. I don't know what to say to people here, but every time we go near a crisis, we don't set in mode fix the problem. We set in mode the politics attached to the problem. I don't really care how or why this climate change is occurring and the other occurrences in weather, for example. I just care about my children and how we're going to fix it so they can have a future here. In reference to World War III, it depends on how we undertake it. If everybody agrees to not engage with nuclear devices, I would say it would be similar to, although, but different than World War II because of technology today, because of cyber, because of a lot of other technologies that we could utilize in order to neutralize the effectiveness of an adversary. I don't understand man's preoccupation with destroying each other. I don't get this. I really don't understand that. We apparently have some very defective people who are running governments in this country, perhaps, and globally. And I don't know what they don't understand about, what the end game is going to be here if we engage in another world war. Nothing good will come of it, right? No one may survive if we start to use nuclear devices because we could end up with a nuclear winter. I just don't understand what the people who are so educated don't understand. Maybe we're overthinking these problems. Maybe the answers aren't in books. Maybe we shouldn't intellectualize everything. Maybe we should just break it down to simple approaches in problem solving, understanding human nature and dealing with people so you can anticipate where they may start and where they may end. We've got to get the cuckoo back in the clock, not just in this country, but across the world. I don't know what to say. If you're asking me, will we survive a World War III? It depends on what that World War III translates to. If it's something to do with cyber where devices aren't used that could literally destroy the atmosphere and the environment like a nuclear device, we may be able to talk about it one day. If those devices are used, mankind is doomed. And it isn't just the United States and Russia. It will be planet-wise. There's discussions about targeted assassinations, which I think is a very dangerous discussion. There is no question that foreign governments have engaged in that activity, and so has ours, by the way. We assassinated Diem in Vietnam in the early 60s, no secret. We've assassinated a number of leaders, I would say, in the name of national security. I would just say that this is a practice that we should try to avoid and abandon. Now, I know people in the intelligence community and in government might want to argue that point, and I do think there's a discussion to be had because there's always an exception to the rule. That's one thing I do want to say, Jenny. So I hope this has answered your question. I wish you had called in and had an exchange. This way you could have a response to my response, but it is what it is. I'm going to go to another email from Dan from Oxnard, California, an area I'm quite familiar with. He says, Lou, I'm a loyal listener, and I want to ask you about a lighthearted question. You have an impressive head of hair for someone your age. Can you give us guys, can you give a guy in his young 30s whose hair is thinning your secret to nice, thick head of lettuce? I appreciate it. I almost feel like this came from Lloyd or Ryan, but to be very honest with you, it's genetic. I had a lot of uncanny athletic ability. Everything I have is genetics. My height, everything. My muscle mass, my slow twitch, my fast twitch fibers, everything is genetically attached. And I will say to you, I had a good gene pool. When men weren't living, when they passed Social Security, I think the life expectancy was 62. Both my grandfathers, my mother's father and my father's father, both lived to 94. My dad almost made it to 96. My mother made it to 85, doing as much as she could to prevent herself from living. I won't get into the discussion. It's really such an interesting critique about people. My mom was an incredible woman, an incredible cook, and just didn't take care of herself. She was strong as a horse. She was from Arkansas. That's my answer for that question, my friend. It's just damn genetics, and I don't know if there's medications. I mean, go to the doctors. Let's go back to the scientists, because they're the people that make our lives better. They're, by the way, part of our celebrity group, not the entertainers. Melinda from Ohio asks, Lou, AOC becomes the fifth House Democrat to call on Clarence Thomas to resign and be impeached over his wife's January 6th text to the White House, then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, to challenge Trump's 2020 election loss. Should Thomas resign? No, because his wife's entitled to have an opinion, and he cannot be held accountable for her opinion. It's really that simple. That doesn't mean that Clarence Thomas is like-minded. It just means that he's married to a woman that happens to be politically attached to the government in a different way. Why would I hold you accountable for something that your wife feels? We have political families. One is spouse is a Democrat and the wife is a Republican. So if the views collide, do we penalize the other because they're not in alignment with what everybody thinks is correct? I don't know. Maybe we should just let women speak their own minds and have that autonomy and independence that we constantly, I would say, refer to. Although we just pander to women. We're not going to have that conversation right now, but we should one day, because it really bothers me what we do with our women in this society. By the way, he does have a lifetime appointment, so it isn't just that simple. And, as far as Miss AOC goes, she's an intelligent young woman. I think she's fairly well educated. Her life travels alarm me, because I think she went from a bartender to an elected official. And I can tell you the difference between her and I. I've traveled this planet. I've traveled this country. I've been exposed to a lot of different people on different levels with different thinking. And I just sat there and listened and observed. I learned a lot about life, a lot about people, a lot about myself. AOC has a lot to say because she's a young woman, and we're afraid of her. Let's be honest. The Democratic Party is afraid of her. We're afraid of women today because, for the purpose of men, we're having our Day of Atonement, a Day of Atonement. Women have not been treated properly since the beginning of time. That's my opinion. We need to change it, not pander. So it's interesting, though. The one thing about AOC is she goes after everyone. I have to be candid with you. She's going after Biden right now. They have their own agenda, this, how would you say, demographic in the Democratic Party, and it takes no prisoners. So I want to go into another email. Rick from Tallahassee, he's asking this. Gas prices soaring, housing market through the roof, grocery prices are up. Yet according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, job openings and labor turnover released Tuesday, there are 11.3 million job openings. How are people affording these skyrocketing prices if they are not working? Well, I'm not sure they're not working. I mean, I'm really trying to figure out what is fact and what is fiction, and how to reconcile all of these statistics and what they really translate to in the most accurate, literate sense. In other words, when you say 11.3 million jobs and the public isn't working, what sector of the public? What's the age demographic? You just can't throw a number out there and try to make us guess as to what it translates to. As far as people affording, we're not going to be able to afford at the rate of that this inflation is progressing, and gasoline prices are going up. This translates to something referred to as disposable income. People will not have disposable income to go to restaurants, movie theaters, vacations. We're going to cut all that out. We're going to cut out all the incidental spending on dinners and buying things we normally wouldn't buy, clothing, something you would like to have but you don't need. You'll do without. It's going to impact this economy dramatically. Your truckers are paying over $5 a gallon consistently for diesel fuel. That's going to be passed on to the consumer, another increase of pricing that we're going to inherit that's going to attach to your disposable income. I don't know what to say to everyone. I mean, yes, I do. Why am I lying to you guys? Yes, I do. This is what the problem is. We're sitting in Washington, D.C., thinking these answers are in books, and they're not. Okay? We intellectualize everything. We have a bunch of people in D.C., many of them who are lawyers. And we know when you go near a lawyer, everything gets exponentially more complicated. There's that anachronism I love. Keep it simple, stupid. KISS. Let's bring this back down to basics. The reality of the situation is that this whole notion of shutting down a pipeline, which has chain reacted into many other episodes or events, has harmed us. No one is against transitioning from fossil fuel or any type of fuel that harms the environment or potentially harms the environment, which is another discussion, to a cleaner form of energy that doesn't harm the environment. But you must be positioned with the technology to support that transition, and it must be done in an incremental manner. Not that you shocked our nervous system, which is what Biden did. You know, I don't have issues with the president on a personal level. I question his judgment. I question people like AOC, Tlaib, Omar, Cori Bush, Maxine Waters, Julian Castro, this younger generation, let me not forget Beto O'Rourke, this younger generation of politicians that seem to think they know the answers to these things. You're all wet behind the ears. Travel another 20, 30 years. Wait till you realize how much you will amass in knowledge and understanding about life. You guys are living in like a one-lane road. You know, I joke about people. I say they named a street after you, one way. That's what we're looking at. We are in a crisis. We need to reopen the pipeline to give this country relief. It was short-sighted and ill-conceived, and the Democratic leadership caved to this transitional thinking, which I'm not opposed to. No one sane, rational, or reasonable is adverse to something that benefits the planets, because that translates to our children and their future. But it has to be done with a certain level of, how would you say, method to your madness, which existed. They were talking about turning off the Line 5 pipeline that comes through Michigan. Yeah, let's add to the financial crisis and duress you're subjecting the American public to. And don't dare insult my intelligence again, telling me that this was Putin who caused the increase in gas prices. That occurred way before this invasion into the Ukraine. Or he's responsible for the 7.9, almost 8% inflation rate. Are you suggesting to me that we dealt a hand to a foreign entity adversarial in nature that would allow them to have an impact on our economy and the stability of our country, which could translate to the infrastructure, which translates to a national security concern? We gave a foreign entity that type of position and power in this country? I hope that is not what you're saying. And it is what you just said. This is ridiculous. The cuckoo left the clock. You know, we need to change the thinking process in this country. We need to put the swords down. We need to stop politicizing everything and look at the eyes of this world through the eyes of our children and their future. And have your decisions be guided by that. I don't get this. Do you love your politics more than you love your kids? Do you love your political agenda more than you love your kids? I don't get this. You know, and this thing about electricity, we use steam turbines that are fueled by fossil fuel, right? Or nuclear, or geothermal, or a solar thermal. You know, you got to get in the real world with me, folks. And by the way, all these batteries that you want to put in the cars come out of China. They got us pigeonholed again. If they suddenly decide we're not going to sell you batteries, which they could do under the right circumstances, we won't be able to drive cars. What are you thinking about? Do this intelligently. We do nothing intelligently here. We do it emotionally, we do it politically, but we don't do it intelligently. And sadly, a lot of the media, not all of them, there's some responsible journalists out there, contrary to public opinion, carry this mantra. And so do some of our elected officials. We need to dial this down, guys, and pull our horns in, because you are putting the future of our children in grave danger. That's all I want to say on this topic. Before I forget, guys, plug into this Phantom Rescue with Frank Smith and Tony Sparks. They abduct people and sex traffic them. I know it doesn't concern you because it hasn't hit home yet, but it could. It should be something that this government is targeting a bit more adamantly. We should have a task force. Look into this operation, Phantom Rescue. It's quite interesting. Any event, I think we're going to let it go for today, guys. I got my blood pressure up enough. It just troubles me that we We just can't see the forest for the trees. And before I forget, I do want to thank our sponsors. I do want to remind you, go to betweenthelines.tv to listen to shows. You could participate. I'm asking you to participate. I'm asking you to become part of this conversation, which I'm going to hope is going to lend itself to change. We need to have a movement here. Obama talked about change. I didn't see much, to be very candid with you, especially in the minority communities. In any event, I'm not going to continue the show. I'm trying to end the show, and as you can tell, it's very hard. Anyway, guys, thank you for joining me today, and we hope to hear from you guys very, very soon. Lou Palumbo, Between the Lines. I bid you adieu.